Thanks everybody so much for joining us today. We have an amazing panel ready to have a discussion around race. Here at Paylocity, we really believe in the whole idea of forward together. And, we believe in the idea of transparency and collaboration. And we think conversations just like this make us all better, right? So a terrific opportunity we had to really partner with the Burtin Group really allows us to stay in line with really our mission. We believe it makes us a better and more inclusive organization. During the panel discussion, we really encourage you to participate, ask questions, and fully engage. We just wanted to say proactively, thank you for joining us. On behalf of Paylocity and our leadership team and the Burtin Group and all the panelists, thanks so much for joining us. And now welcome Darnell Burtin, today's moderator.
John, thank you very much. So not really sure, John, James, Ryan, if you're staying, you're part of the group. We're going to ping on you to ask questions. If not, I'm going to ask you guys to jump off or just hide your camera, and I'm going to bother these other folks here really quickly. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. The conversation of race, we understand, is one that's super important. The question was, what about race is so important right now in today's society? But I would beg to ask, is it just today, or is this something that's been historical? Rather than spend my time talking about Darnell Burtin, really quickly, Darnell Burtin, the Burtin Group, I'm a father, a fundraiser, a friend, a servant leader, and a community advocate. So let's just leave that there. I want to spend most of the time diving into the people we've brought on the panel today. Just quick introduction: Pamyla Brown, Turner Construction, Citizenship and Community Engagement. GiShawn Mance, Associate Professor and Co-Chair at Howard University. She's going to say the Howard, HU, right? All that stuff, Michael Vaul. Mike, if I pronounced that last name wrong, I'm sorry. He's one of my friends. He's my fraternity brother. This man is a 35-year veteran of the YMCA, of the YUSA. He's in a national leadership position, specifically dealing with people of color right now. And Dr. Lewis Woods, who's a presidential fellow, it's a big title, Lewis, presidential fellow down in Nashville. Allow these folks to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Mike. Please give us your quick yet detailed introduction of yourself. You're on mute, Mike.
Sorry. Husband, father, man of God. I would say too, those husband and father are most important to me. I'm the strategy leader for boys and young men of color to improve the outcomes for the national wide.
All right. Dr. Lewis Woods.
Husband and father as well. Presidential fellow for social justice and equality at Middle Tennessee State. And I'm also an associate professor of African American history.
Fantastic. Dr. Mance.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am a mother, so you may actually hear my little one. That's the reality of COVID and being at home. She is 8 weeks old, so if you hear her cries, it's music to my ears. But I am assistant professor of psychology at Howard University and a licensed clinical psychologist.
And last but not least, Pamyla Brown.
So to bring a little levity to it, I'm actually sitting in a empty classroom in Des Moines, Iowa. So if I have to move my hands to keep the lights from going off, please excuse me. But as Darnell said, my name is Pamyla Brown. I am mother and wife. I am the Community and Citizenship Director for Turner Construction in Chicago. But most importantly, I am an advocate for people, advocate for businesses, and I think that I serve an industry, if you will, or represent an industry in which race has always been at the baseline of all of our discussions. So happy to join the discussion today.
Absolutely. So the reason we're kind of moving quickly through the introductions is we really want to spend today in the meat of the conversation. Darnell Burtin, you guys heard me talk about fundraising. That's my full-time job, and partnering with Paylocity is really where I found myself in the last couple months. I should say in the last couple years, really getting pulled to have these conversations about equity. What does equity look like? What does diversity look like? What does that really mean? Let's be really frank here. Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and the list goes on and on and on. Minneapolis. This continues to be a conversation that we're having to have, and the question is why are we having to have it, right? Is it systemic racism? Is it an issue with, how we handle law enforcement, or is it just something that, for whatever reason, we haven't been able to communicate those, what I call those blind spots, right? And so today, what I'd love for us to do with each of these panelists is really dig into why is this conversation of race so important? And if we could we put up the poll question now? Thank you. We would love for you to take 2 or 3 quick minutes here to answer the poll questions. And those questions will be used as part of our conversation today. Really important, would love for you all to answer these questions because it'll help, one, drive some conversation after we've gotten through this initial piece of having everyone kind of chime in. But additionally, it's really important because everyone is looking at this conversation very differently. We're going to try our best to stay away from some topics, but in the same breath, we really want to dig into some of those other topics. So here's what we would love to do. If you finished the poll, raise your hand on our panelists. Did you guys take the poll? No, they didn't even take the poll. So here's what we'd love to do. I'm going to start off with Dr. GiShawn Mance. Dr. Mance, why is this conversation of race so important today? Or is this something that we historically have needed to talk about for quite some time? In saying that, I would ask that all of the panelists, please feel free to converse and chime in with Dr. Mance as we move through this conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Burtin. Can I just call you Darnell?
Call me Darnell.
Thank you for this panel and definitely for this question. I would definitely go with the latter, that it's always been important. When you think about the structure of this country and how it was built, race has always been at the center of kind of building up the structure of who deserves to have a seat at the table, who deserves to be heard, who deserves to be counted as a person. So it has always been very important to have the conversation. Your question when you ask, is it important or why is it important to talk about race at this point in history or at this point in society? The only thing I could think of when I saw your question was, initially I was like, it's always been important, but whose attention do we have now? Who's willing to speak, stand, even if it's symbolic? Because let's be real about this. Some of these actions and gestures are just that. They're just gestures, and there's a symbolism for equity or a symbolism for diversity, but there's not necessarily any true movement. And what I mean by that is who's being hired, who's at the table, who's making decisions, policies, all of those things. And so I think it's really important now because we have at least individuals, groups, and organizations at least willing to have even if it's performative, a performative and symbolic representation as it means when it comes to talking about race. From a psychological standpoint, it is very important to talk about race. And I'm going to break it down in regards to specifically for Black people and why it's important from a psychological standpoint to really talk about race, because racial trauma and the experience of racial trauma has been ongoing. And the manifestation of that has played out in different aspects of one's life. So whether it is family, whether it is jobs, education, all of those things, the trauma, the racial trauma that one experiences of just being Black in America, it's a day-to-day experience. And so now it's at the forefront where their voice can be heard, but also it's almost like the recurring trauma. The trauma happens over and over and over and over again because it's on social media and you see it and it's happening over and over again. And I just have to tell you, from my private practice, I am booked and busy. Why? Because of the trauma that people are experiencing and saying that I can't even go to work.
So GiShawn, thank you. I need to jump in here on that because this is reasons one. You could take 2 hours talking about this piece, and I feel that. But I think this is great. First of all, thank you. This is a great segue to Michael, because you are someone who personally knows someone that's been in the national mainstream that's experienced this level of trauma. And so, Mike, I want to jump to you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I am from the same hometown as Jacob Blake. And so there are 3 Jacob Blakes. There's Jacob Blake Jr., who got shot 7 times in the back. There's his father, Jacob Blake Sr., and then there's actually Pastor Blake, who is Jacob Blake, who is my family's pastor. So we have known this family for 50 plus years. So I think the one thing, and I'll just piggyback on the statement. I do think we have to be mindful of not just what we are experiencing in business, but we also remind ourselves what we're experiencing as it relates to trauma broadly. So here's an example. We see Jacob Blake getting shot 7 times on the video camera. What we don't think about is one of his 3 of his sons is going to experience some trauma somewhere down the road where they're going to burst. And they're going to do something that is not going to be good for us or them because they saw their father get shot 7 times. Now, magnify that times the boys that are also looking on these phones, and then magnify it again to corporate Black men and women who are inside corporate institutions. And so we have to remember that it is magnified. Whenever we see things on video, it's magnified by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and possibly the hundreds of thousands and millions. And so we have to be mindful that we have to get upstream. And I think it would go without saying, I think, and then I'll pass the torch. We have to also acknowledge that we come out of a debate last night where civic leadership is also in question. When we rely on culture being driven by civic leadership and in our inability to be equipped to serve community is what we saw yesterday. And so those are all things that are creating trauma and have elevated race, the lack of understanding of self and the lack of understanding of belonging to other people.
So, Mike, thank you for that. I want to use that piece that you were talking about from the corporate piece. We have Pamyla Brown on here today, and she's representing our corporate diversity part of this conversation. Pam, can you speak to that specifically? I think that's a really, I never thought of that, how GiShawn talked about the trauma. Mike talked about the lasting effects of the trauma and how it's moving upstream. And, I was having a conversation with some young men that I mentor, and I realized that there's a level of PTSD that I have, right? Growing up in the inner city of Chicago. And I never thought about it. I'll share a personal story. I remember being in 3rd grade and my uncle saying, here's a knife, carry it in your pocket. So when you walk to school to catch the bus, you're okay. With my sons, right? Who gives a 3rd grader that? But it wasn't that he was saying that because he didn't love me. It was more, I love you so much here to protect yourself. So Pam, I want to bring that to you. That was a great segue from the corporate piece of it.
So I think it's a couple of different things. Lots of great topics here. First and foremost, I want to address the fact that these are not blind spots. These are just spots which have been ignored. So it's like you put enough pressure on a pipe, it bursts, right? And so you talk about trauma, and then you talk about folks not having access to resources, right? To make their lives better, if you will. And so in the construction industry, that's what we see. We see it in the hood, but we don't see anyone who looks like us on these different job sites, right? So if you take away the whole concept of being able to see and being able to earn a living for yourself and for your family, and add to it all the other socio, economical, environmental, and all that trauma piled on top of one another, I look at it like this. I believe in the Lord. The Lord stopped the world to get the attention of what was happening to Black people here in America, right? And so as Dr. Mance pointed out, look whose attention we've got. So whether whether there are performative statements that people are making, I feel that especially in corporate America, that it is my job with access to resources and access to the room, if you will, right? To make certain that the conversations are actually happening, that we're not paying attention and really harping on the fact of the uprisings that are happening around the country and in our neighborhoods or whatever. It is our job as civic leaders, right, and thought leaders to make certain that the conversation stays where it is. How do we bring these resources to our communities, right? How do we stand in our spaces and speak truth to power to really speak to this? And so I think that, as Dr. Mance was saying, like, I'm probably gonna call someone right now as far as it needing someplace to dump some stuff or whatever the case may be, because it's becoming harder and harder to actually do this work in this space and be your most authentic self. So I think as we talk about how do we do this and how, why now? Why now? Because it's right now. You have a choice. Either you believe that this is a human issue or you don't. There's no between.
So Thank you for that. And I'm going to segue to Dr. Woods, because I think this is a piece where both, one, you teach, but two, one, you've lived about this human issue, right? So I'd love for you to chime in there. But before that, panelists, questions have come in. If you want to take a stab at the questions while you're not talking, please feel free to do so in written form. Dr. Woods, on to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to y'all. Look, I mean, I grew up in a town in Long Island, Port Jefferson, North Shore, New York, about 65 miles east of Manhattan. I was diversity. There were two Black students, myself and another Black male, in my elementary school. And by the time we got to high school of about 1,000, there were about 5 of us. And so I spent the lion's share of my teenage years trying to convince my white friends, classmates, colleagues, counterparts, that the racism that I experienced and that I saw around me was real. And it's what mental health professionals talk, the term they call is gaslighting. And so I felt like essentially that I had to prove or validate or justify what I knew that I personally experienced, because people that I talked to it about it would question it. And so really, I've made a career out of compiling enough evidence to make sure that if I was ever gaslighted again or made to feel like I was paranoid or that I didn't know what I experienced, that if I ever had one of those conversations, I would have an arsenal of evidence to stop conversations, or at least to provide context. And I think that why this is such an important conversation about race that we're having now is it took the world stopping for a critical mass of white Americans to engage this conversation, right? Black Lives Matter is not new. Even the words that George Floyd spoke, "I can't breathe," are not new. And it took essentially the entire world completely stopping and you couldn't ignore it, for us to have a national reckoning. And I appreciate that we have it. And it's an extreme set of circumstances that have gotten us to this point where we have to have a conversation. Let me just say something briefly. If you don't talk about systems and structures in terms of institutional barriers for Black and brown people, especially people of African ancestry, you miss the mark, right? The first 12 generations of people of African ancestry were enslaved. The next 5 roughly were segregated. And then we've had about 2.5 generations or so of mass incarceration. So we've seen, really, when you study African-American history, it's like a euphemism for studying the evolution of systemic racism or for white supremacy, right? And so slavery, followed by segregation, followed by mass incarceration, right? Lynching, followed by police terror or police brutality. And so it's really a continuum of the trauma that my colleagues were talking about.
So let me, you got to wave your arm, Pam. You got to get up and walk away. So, you guys bring to the forefront some great, and we could probably spin this in 10 different directions, right? Again, please answer some of the questions if you aren't talking, but if you are, focus on. Dr. Woods, I really appreciate that. Can we spend some time really addressing this thing that has kind of boggled me, right? I would like to understand, you often hear, if you just get out of the car, if you just, whether it's car or you just get the right degree, if you just wear the right shirt and tie, if you just, GiShawn, talk to me about that. What is this? Is there really an if you just, or is that another part of that, the trauma? Because even if you just, you'll never get to be there. You understand what I'm asking there? So.
Yeah, I think it's an oversimplification of a larger issue. And when I hear people say, they would have just comply, or just whatever, just fill in the blank, right? What I'm hearing is a person that's trying to make sense of a system that does not make sense, right? And particularly when I hear a person of color, so Black and brown people really trying to make sense of, like, if you just do this, if you just do that, what I'm hearing is the system was never meant for you, but you're trying to navigate a system where the rules keep changing, right? So you may have a person who just leaves their hand on the steering wheel, or a person who wants to try and be more physically acceptable to a majority population. So whether that is dressing a certain way, their hairstyle is a certain way. What I'm seeing is that person has kind of internalized what the values are of another system, and they're trying to adopt them to make sense and make meaning of who they are in this larger system that wasn't designed for them. So it's never just, it's not just, there's so many nuances, and you have to contextualize it. So then it turns people, particularly people of color, some may struggle to kind of really understand their sense of identity. And where do I belong, and what do I do in order to keep myself safe and have the sense of authenticity. So I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. Mike, I want you to jump in. I saw you coming off anyway, Mike. Go ahead. And I want to ask you this specifically as it pertains to the audience of people, young men and Black boys that you're talking about.
Well, so I think GiShawn really highlighted something I think is really important for people to really think about, is there structural inequities, and you can miss those very clearly when you only go to a very small source of data. So I think Brother Wood sort of expanded it out. But I think what we have to really be mindful of is we are creating, because of sometimes our symbolic nature and oversimplification of our work, we sometimes miss actually the depth and the need to equip ourselves on how to see other people. And so I would just say, I think when you look at boys of color, so I work in a YMCA, a very large global organization. I would be remiss to tell you that that is an organization that sees Black and brown people. But my job is to ensure that inside this, as a Black leader, is that I also have people see me so that they can see the boys. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, because I want to be clear with sisters on, right, we see the sisters too, but I think it's clear for me, broadly, if you look, particularly the United States, until we see boys of color, right? Girls are going to improve. Girls are actually doing better. Women are doing better than men broadly. But I think the data would tell us until we see those boys, and I really don't care what color you are. I have my son, my youngest son is actually on the call. But I would say until we see the boys, it's going to be hard for us to see economic ability for all. You see this background screen that I have. There's a fading American dream. That dream is fading for everyone, but it's really failing boys and young men of color.
So I think
it'd be hard to see other problems.
Go ahead, Pam. Thanks, Mike.
So Michael, to your point, I think it's really, really important that we not get caught up in dissecting, right, where the issues are and where the problems are, right? Because I could say for Black young women, right, we are put out of school, expelled, that are far higher than that in those of that nature. But I also think that even in our community, we are victims, right? We are victims and victimizers, if you will, of the structures that have been put in place, because we wear it. And we wear it in a very, very different way. My son was sharing with me about Breonna Taylor, and he genuinely asked me, "Ma, who speaks up for you?" And I said, "I am dependent on you to have these kind of conversations and do that." So I think that as a collective, as a Black collective community, we all have a role to play in this revolution, right? And it is our job and our responsibility, and our responsibility and the price that we pay to being part of this movement, right? To pick up arms in whatever way that we can. So I don't want us to fall into the trap, if you will, of separating out the issues right now, because right now it's a we problem. And, we got to figure out how we tackle that, you know, and it's so ridiculous, right? That's why it's so hard to understand it, because it's such a ridiculous concept, right? That you don't even realize that you are truly being victimized as you go to shop for groceries in your local neighborhood.
So let me jump in there, and this isn't going to segue, but Dr. Wilson, I want to come to you. Is, you know, when I was growing up, I spent a lot of my time going to either service or as a Boy Scout in the Rockwell Garden housing projects. the Salvation Army, right? It was one of those change agent moments for my life where it was a safe haven in a lot of chaos. But the thing that I was reminded of as I would serve food in frontline feeding, or I would play basketball out in the park in the Rockwell Garden housing projects, was you couldn't get support, you couldn't get money, you couldn't get food stamps if there were men in the home. So the men were purposely taken out of the homes. We're talking the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, so that this system could survive. And it wasn't until, what, Pam, maybe 10 years ago to those housing projects, 10, 15 years ago, those housing projects came down because it was broken. There was this history of no men, families, kids, jail. No men, families, kids, jail. And it was never ending. And the only way that you could live in this environment, or that you could survive, is if there was no man in the home. So Mike, I understand your piece as you're talking about the men's section, but Pam, I understand your piece too, because were they victims or were they victimizers saying, you can't stay here because I can't eat, I can't get my check if you are living in my home? And so, Dr. Woods, I want to throw that to you as you talk about this multi-generational issue of, it is systemic, but does the Black community have a way out, or is there a what I call group cooperation, Mike, right? Group cooperation. Is there something that we or the Black community could or should be doing to enact or affect change?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the challenges I see about when you start talking about it generationally is, broken people raise broken people, right? And as a community, we've never had the time or the ability really to reflect on the generational trauma that we have inherited. And why I say that, and I think this is significant, is that, parents, the primary job of a parent is to keep your child safe, right? I'm raising 2 girls. After what I saw with Breonna Taylor, and that nobody got charged for killing her essentially in her sleep in her house, how do I then tell my daughters how to navigate safely a police encounter, right? If you're not safe in your own apartment, it's a very difficult conversation. And I think these difficult conversations have been happening in the Black community for generations. My grandfather was a police officer, NYPD from the 53 to about the mid 70s. And he told us how very explicitly how to survive police stops, right? But Black parents have been having that same conversation with how to avoid being lynched, how to avoid being brutalized on the plantation. And so when you start thinking about the generational trauma and how parents are desperate to keep their kids safe in a space that has been profoundly anti-Black historically, and one could make an argument about it being anti-Black right now, the reality is that I think Black people need to give, the more I study Black history, the more I appreciate what Black people have been through. The more I want to give Black people hugs and be like, dude, you made it. You're here. You know what I'm saying? Bring it in. And I say that jokingly, but there's some truth to it, because I think that if you're on the wrong side of institutional systems, and I'm thinking about predatory lending, redlining, institutional systematic divestments in your communities, over policing, terrible educational resources. It's like when I think about what Black people have to deal with just to stay in their current status, the analogy I use is kind of like a salmon swimming upstream. If you have a profoundly strong river current, it requires energy just to stay in place. Because if you stop moving for a second, the current's going to push you backwards, right? And so Black people who have been able to acquire some wealth, acquire some education, have been like salmon swimming upstream against the current, having to jump out of the water against the current to get to the next plane and keep swimming. But as they jump out of the water, what's waiting for them? A bear, a ferocious bear. So you got to dodge the bear teeth, hit the ground, and keep swimming. And you do that over and over again as you climb up the socioeconomic riverbed. And by the time you get to the top of it, like the salmon, you die of exhaustion. And so from my perspective, I think it's important for us to understand that there are systems and structures that are invisible perhaps to us, but that affect our life chances and our decision making. And finally, if you're on the wrong side, I mean, on the right side of the current, even if you stop swimming, you can still be pushed forward by the current process. So not to say that you're not swimming and you're not working hard, but if you stop, you still make progress. And I think that's important for us to think about in terms of calibrating our individual choices amidst systems and systemic issues.
So Pam, I want to come to you. Go ahead and answer. And then after this, I want to show the results of the poll.
I wanted to speak to something that he just mentioned about invisible systems, right? So I'm a fan of movies and TV. And one of my favorite movies is Trading Places, right? If you're not familiar with the movie, you know, it's Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy. Dan Aykroyd is this wealthy person and Eddie Murphy is this kind of homeless person or whatever. Two rich white men decided that they were going to do their own social experiment and bet a dollar to see what happens when you take the riches away from one and then put the other one there, whatever. So the white guy, Dan Aykroyd, extremely ticked off, right, at the black guy who has his life and all this other stuff, right? Black guy, neither of them know what's going on. Eddie Murphy finds out it's all because of a bet, right? In this scenario, there was this invisibility that was happening up here, but it made them act out a certain way because of where they were. So I would even go so far as to say that even the folks who are saying that systemic racism doesn't exist or these systems don't exist, they don't even know that they're being victimized by the system as well, because it's just so damn ridiculous, pardon my language. But nevertheless, I think it's a way that we have to really figure this out. How do we bring to light that systemic racism is actually killing all of us? We just have different murderers. That's all.
So thank you for that. I'm going to take not a pause. If we pause the poll questions, I think this is a good time for us to share the answers. What was your reaction to the Breonna Taylor, indictments? I was disappointed, but not surprised. That's overwhelming. Which elements of the criminal justice system do you feel need to be reformed? 79% of you said national standard for excessive use of force. Incorporation of racial bias training. Pam, I want to come back to you on this piece here, and GiShawn as well. Removal of the no-knock warrants, independent investigations. Wow, all of these scored really high, to be honest with you. Does systemic racism personally impact your life? 10% said no, 90% said yes. Have you participated in efforts to initiate social justice reform? I'd say it's 50-50, right? Some protests and some have used the social media. Thank you guys for participating in this. I really appreciate it. Mike, we received a question, and I think you were the person to answer this at this time. And then GiShawn, I want to come to you. There's a question that has been asked from our audience. Mike, can you read the question that I shared with you, and can you maybe address it in the most appropriate way you feel possible?
Thank you. I said appropriate. So the question says, what are you?
So Mike, can I share a little bit really quick about you?
Sure.
Mike, can you describe why your element or your coming at this question may be different from the rest of us, just from a personal, your home life, your personal perspective?
So tell me what you mean specifically.
Your son with the blue eyes.
Okay. Thank you, brother. Yeah, I think Darnell's my youngest son is on. So Bo is my youngest son who is on here, but I have, my wife is white and Jewish, and I'm a Christ follower, and people ask us how we can coexist. And I always say to people, she lives in the front half of that book and I live in the back half. So the front and the back, right? So we sort of, maybe the last verse is Malachi 4:6, which says, parents will love their children, children love their parents, will also be a wicked curse. My boy lies, but they self-select as black. So it is really important. I've been back to, this is everybody's problem. And I would say this, because I think Pam said this. I think it's so important to first reference before I read the question, something that James Baldwin said, right? It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Okay, so that's the precursor of the question. The question says, what are your feelings after last night's debate and the stand ready words Trump sent to the Proud Boys? This was asked, and I'm not going to, so how do you address that question? And the reason you address that question is you go back to, until you have, if your ignorance is not with shared power, and your ignorance is to hold on to power and to lead with power, and to lead against people. We are not a democracy and we are not human. And back to Pam's statement, none of us win when only some of us win. And we forget that our tax-based system is actually based on that, right? That essentially when everybody's giving, right? I always tell people that people do one of two things. They either make taxes or take taxes. So either you're going to create them to make or take. And for those who want to hold on to the power, then you are relenting to give more than you need to, because that is essentially you shut the people off from the system. And so until we really see other people as us, until we really belong to people, until we equip ourselves, what you saw last night is, I think, a lack of civic leadership, a lack of following rules that you would agree to. And then you see that play out where it says, right, that you are not allied to democracy and to economic justice for all. And so you can't say the words, and you can't say white supremacy, and you can't say and then you move to a group, you dodge the question by moving to another group. It tells us who you are in your leadership style. And I think as we think about business, it's the same way. You have to address the issues in culture. If you don't address those issues in your own culture, then it will come back to you and it will take you over.
Mike, I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that in a way that doesn't become inflammatory, because let me be very frank, guys. We could spend the entire conversation on that topic last night and it can become an issue. And today we want to really address the conversation of race. And while I think that is an important topic, there's so many more facets of that conversation. So let me ask the ladies on the call. There was a specific question that says, how do the women on the panel show up at work every day knowing the system is against people of color? How do you smile and remain professional at all times? GiShawn?
Yeah, I attempted to take a stab at that question. I'm lucky enough to be a professor at a HBCU. So don't get me wrong, there are other structures in place that impact women that are there, very much present, that are there. But prior to being at Howard University, I was at a PWI that was in DC. And it was very much known for a certain type of student body to be at that institution. I'll just go ahead and be frank. You can Google me and know where I was. I was at American University and then came over to Howard University. When I was at American University, one of the reasons why I left, because I had a lot of people asking, why would you leave American University and be at Howard University? That question was loaded in so many ways. I'm not going to unpack that right now. But I remember being there and not feeling valued. And although I had the same degree, I had the same amount of knowledge, probably more experience and knowledge than my colleagues, I wasn't valued. And so my work is community-based research. It's community-based because when you talk about health disparities, yes, I have an office as a psychologist, but it's really important to go into the community. Because not everybody is going to go to an office to get the services, right? So if I'm in the community and helping to build programs and structures that exist within the community, then you're doing sustainability, capacity building, all of those things. And I remember a colleague saying, what is this thing like community? What is that? It's not real science. And this was a person who did their research on rats. So it's important, don't get me wrong, that's important research as well, but mine is I value to my work. And when I went to Howard, it was a very different experience. It was there was value in the work that I was doing. It wasn't a question. I did not have to justify my work and the people who I'm working with, which is essentially communities of color. I didn't have to justify that. I did not have to do, kind of give a rationale to show that it is science and it is important. So when I was an American, I focused on the future. I focused on the larger picture. I focused on what my life's work was going to be. And so that was really important to me. So when I would hear those off-color comments, I also didn't take on the responsibility of having to educate my colleagues. That's your responsibility. And I'm not going to take on that burden because I'm already a Black woman at this institution that doesn't even recognize me as equal. So the last thing I'm going to do, and then there's the student of color who will constantly come to me for mothering, if you will, while I'm also supposed to be publishing and doing all of these things in academia. And so the last thing I was going to do is take on my colleagues as well to kind of get them to kind of have an understanding so we can have room for a conversation. I did my work, and I was willing to open up the dialogue, but I wasn't willing to do the to educate. That was something that they need to have the onus. So to answer the question, how do essentially when I was in that type of environment, and even at Howard, how do I continue to kind of show up and smile, is that I stay focused on the work, the future, the purpose, what I want, why, essentially my purpose, why I am there, and I don't get distracted by it, even though there's a lot of things that can distract you.
Thank you for that, Pam. This is and GiShawn, thank you, because I think you guys are going to give two different perspectives, one from the education, nonprofit, other side, which GiShawn. Pam, I would love your perspective purely from this corporate and even corporate construction, because I think you're going to divest in this a little bit. Just a time check, we're at 12:40. We're going to continue at this, but about the 10-minute mark, we're going to start to wane ourselves, but great conversation. We're getting emails from LinkedIn. Keep asking your questions. Panelists, keep answering these questions if you can, and I'm going to lean on those. Pam, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I'll add to that. I actually shared with the CEO of our company. He is the CEO of 10,000 staff people. And I told him that it was a really difficult time right now, being this sort of triple consciousness, if you will, right? Being Black, being a woman, and then working in corporate America. And then add to that is construction. Women make up less than 3% of the entire industry, right? And so it's hard to show up in this space. However, I come from years of being an advocate. So I only know one way to be, and that is myself. So the truth of the matter is, even if I were not with the company I'm with, I would still be doing the same thing. So ignore the lights. I'll get up in a minute. But nevertheless, what I have come to know and what I appreciate is that when I say that this is a we problem, if I'm not there, they can forget that we exist. If I am not there in my lane, speaking truth to power and really, really challenging the status quo in that way, then I feel like I've not done my job, right? And I've not come full circle. It is hard. It has been really, really hard, especially in this space right now, because now everyone is woke, right? And everyone's talking about all these different things or whatever. So while I don't see it as an opportunity to educate people, because that is not my job, that is what Google is for. And in my back of the day, in Encyclopedia Britannica, however you want to say it, or whatever the case may be. But what I will do is make certain that I am helping to create a brave space so that you can say those things that you've been thinking, so I can let you know whether or not you own base or not, or whatever the case may be. So it's really hard to do. But when you think about it from a collective point of view, we need you to show up in these different spaces, because we need you there as a voice to speak for the collective.
So let me say this, Mike, really quickly. I appreciate everyone on this call, because and I want to thank Paylocity for offering this platform, because Paylocity is obviously, and John spoke to this when he got on, is understanding that there's the need to have these types of conversations. So I want to thank those folks. And I also want to thank you all for having your authentic selves show up on this and really be transparent. Like I said, we're receiving lots of questions on LinkedIn. I've gotten a number of emails and questions and saying that this is a fantastic panel. Please know this is the first of many, and we appreciate you chiming in. Go ahead, Mike. I apologize.
Very quickly, because I do think Pam and GiShawn, I think they were on to something. I think what we have to be, I'm going to just appeal to, no matter what your primary dimension is for a minute, every personal action leads to the bold collective action that we need. And so it requires everybody to understand self. We are in a moment where if you don't, I always say to people, if I'm a Black man, so if I can't be Black now, I'll never be Black. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily negate that my wife is white and Jewish, right? So we can be who we are together and acculturate together without losing sense of self. And I think it's really, really important for people to realize that whatever we get post the election is it is a reflection of who we are as a people. So what we have to do is, no matter what you are, if you want to seek justice before order, you have a moment in time where you can do that in your company, in democracy, in the right now leadership now.
So thanks for that, Mike. Here's a question, and I want to throw this to Lewis. Allison says, so what's the most pertinent issue and what is to be done now? And I know that's a loaded question. And pertinent, what does that mean in your mind? And what does the now mean? So let's address that.
That's a great question. I think for me, one of the struggles is trying to understand systems and understand how those systems work, how they have historically benefited some and marginalized others. And the reason why I think that's important is because unless you can address structures and systems, right? We like to argue as a country that hard work equals upward mobility, right? That no matter if you work hard and you sacrifice, that you will be
the bootstraps conversation.
Bootstraps, exactly. And so, but when you frame it from the perspective, who worked harder than the enslaved, right? From can't see to can't see, right? In theory, hard work, Black people should have all the things right now, right? But you think about slavery, then you think about sharecropping on top of it. But we know that that's not the reality. And so I think one of the struggles that we have to think about today, at least, is that there is not and has not been a fair starting point. And for those of us who have acquired some education and some resources, we tend to be unicorns even within our own families, let alone the broader Black community, right? And so I think for me, the struggle is talking, giving back to communities where we come from, right? Family members, community members, those of us who are Black and brown, those of us who are white, I think it requires interrupting some of the noise in family functions. I think it requires interrupting some of the damaging conversations that people have around the Thanksgiving table. And it's hard because sometimes being on the right side of justice for a lot of my liberal white friends and colleagues and counterparts often requires them essentially going against their family and their community and being alienated as a result of it, right? And so it's a lot easier to just be silent in the midst of it than attack one's loved one, or at least critique them in a debate style. And so I think part of the challenge that we have as a nation is that, there's always been a history of white people being on the right side of race, being on the right side of history as it pertains to race, and willing to sacrifice and in some cases be beaten and brutalized, and in other cases even killed for their positions. But you can always count them on one or two hands in every generation, which means they're essentially a unicorn too, right? So
Lewis, let me pause you because you're hitting on the. So first of all, fantastic. I appreciate you going there. I was hoping either you or GiShawn would go there. Talk to me about that section of the population, because we're talking about all things in the great Black space and the challenges. But what about the advocates or the partners or the things that you're hearing? Because some of those folks feel like I'm trying and you're still saying I'm not doing enough. So talk to me, both you and then GiShawn, or both you and GiShawn. How do we have folks be great advocates and peers and partners that don't necessarily have the brown or Black skin?
I think it's a great point. Look, my challenge is simple. It's not an easy lift, right? I'm not suggesting that, I'm not trying to browbeat allies here. What I am simply suggesting is that allies are often put in a position that's difficult, right? Because usually white liberals are liberal despite their upbringing, meaning when they go back home for holidays, they're outnumbered around conversations at the house around politics, oftentimes. And so then if they get into difficulties, I have friends who are like, man, I don't want to go home for Thanksgiving. I just can't talk about this stuff right now. It's too much. I don't understand or relate to that at all, because in the broader Black community, there's not much debate around politics. The debate is crazy or extremely crazy, right? There's not that much of a debate within the families, but there clearly is a debate within a lot of white families and white communities. And so one then has to be in a position where, do I ruin the family dinner or the family function speaking my truth, right? Or do I stay silent and complicit in the midst of what's happening in the family? And I don't know what that answer is on a personal level, but I can only imagine that if I was asked to choose between my mother and a community that I'm not connected to in any real tangible way, that's a difficult ask for anybody. And
So
I don't
Louis,
know what
Louis, I got to interject. I got to stop you because
Please.
I want GiShawn to speak on this. That was a great segue, GiShawn, because I think some of this is that mental health piece as well. Go ahead.
I mean, I wanted to hear more of what Louis was
We're gonna go back to Louis, but I want to give everyone look. So here's the real quick. So we're at 12:50. We're gonna stop at 12:55, and we're gonna allow each of you to kind of have a parting words. Going to bring John back on from Paylocity, and then we're gonna end. Again, I can't thank you guys enough. Keep the questions coming. We've got 5 more minutes. Go, GiShawn.
Ooh, 5 minutes. Okay. So one of the things that, as Louis was speaking, it made me think about just a very quick story. It was around the time it was George Floyd. The video was out there, and that's when the professors at Howard was getting a lot of like calls to be on. This is when everybody wants us to be present, right? CNN, NPR, these different news outlets wanted Black representation and professors to speak. And so I had an interview with NPR, and the interviewer was asking essentially, what can you do as a form of resistance as a person of majority culture? And I read to her a text that I written to one of my really good friends. We went to grad school together. She's just an awesome woman. She's an ally, blonde hair, blue eyed, half Jewish, half Catholic, and she's like a sister to me. And the conversation of kind of white privilege, of kind of having that conversation, is very difficult for a lot of people of majority culture. Of being a professor American, I taught at GW, and that was always when I would get my lowest marks for evaluations, when I'm talking about white privilege and what it means to be white in America, and just looking at that as race and as an ethnicity and as a race. And so one of the things I told her was just kind of just speaking up, but I know that was a very simplistic perspective of like, just speak up, be present in the room. But those little conversations that you're having in your circle, they make a difference. And when you're sitting at the table, because if you're at the table and you're able to help make decisions, if you look around and everybody looks like you, then speak up that we need to have some brown and black people, or people of color, people of different experiences, genders, to be in the room. That's how you make the difference. So it doesn't always have to be a big display, right? But it can be just those small conversations, and it's never just going to be one conversation. It's something that if you're committed to, you're just making those comments here and there in your circle over and over and over and over again. And at some point you're planting seeds, and at some point you're thinking that maybe the seed will flourish, or it will make a difference. But speak up in your platform where you do have a platform is essentially what I told her.
So Pam, GiShawn, I want to piggyback on that, and then I want to come to each of you and offer you all a minute or 2 minutes to say your final parting words before we bring John on. I found myself, there's a friend of mine, and we went to, when I was in high school, I was sent to this wonderful prep school that we could never afford, but I got an academic scholarship to go there in Massachusetts. And this young man I've met has become my friend for now over 30 years. And he said to me, Darnell, you are my Black friend. And I said, whoa. He says, not that I'm saying that I don't know other Black people, but you are my Black friend. And because of that, I'm going to ask you some questions that may sound stupid, but I just don't know. It's not my experience, right? And initially, when I was in my teens and 20s, it would annoy me because I'm like, is he really asking me this question? Like, how does he not see it? It wasn't in his purview. But he's been when my mother passed, he flew in and came to the west side of Chicago. He was probably one of 3 Black faces at the funeral of 500 people. And he walked right up to the front and was like, I'm Darnell's friend, right? And so GiShawn, speaking about that friend, he has leveraged at every point, even so much as making the introduction to Paylocity. Like, this is a guy you need to be talking to to help you as an organization further the conversation. So Paylocity doesn't happen without those small conversations that I had with my friend to bring you guys here to have this conversation. And so I want to pause there. We're at 12:55. I'm going to turn to Mike. Everybody gets a minute. Share what your parting words are here.
Yeah, so I would go back, Brother Woods said something, well, we all did. One is, I think you got to get your house right, your own personal ecosystem. If you're not having conversations in your own house, then how you go to the front porch and have it with neighbors and a community? I think you got to get your own house right. So there are 3 practical things I tell people. Don't be too quick to judge others before you judge yourself. The second practical would be, don't send out a social media message or an email message to condemn rather than to invite, right? And then the last would be is to hold conversations with people who don't always share your point of view. Back to your friend, right? The only way you learn is to talk to somebody who doesn't think like you. So those would be the 3 practical steps I would tell people to take.
Well, I appreciate that. Pam?
Okay, I had a whole bunch to say, but nevertheless, I'm gonna keep it to a minute. But Lewis was absolutely right. We are seeing the manifestation of unchecked conversations around the dinner table. That's what we're seeing, number 1. Number 2, courage looks different in different spaces, right? So you may not have the voice just yet to speak up or whatever, but maybe you have the power to leave a room. And sometimes your absence speaks louder than anything else. To many of the white people who are my friends, who I consider to be friends, this is a traumatizing time for them, right? They're experiencing a bunch of ouches and realizing that people that they've loved and respected are racist or hold racist views. So right now, they're experiencing a bunch of ouch moments, but we got to experience the ouch moments to get to the ahas. So, and this is just a shout out to my white allies on social media. I see you, right? I'm a click away and hopping into the conversation, but I don't want to do that. But I would just say to everyone who's listening in today, courage looks different. And whatever it is, you find that space and you be courageous.
Fantastic. GiShawn?
I love what Pam had to say. I want to piggyback off of that because when I would have a lot of people kind of ask, well, what can I do? What can I do? Wherever they fall on the, on the spectrum. So whether people of color, white allies, I took a different perspective and my response was mental health and self-care is also an act of a part of the revolution, if you will, if you want to call it revolution resistance. Is really important to take care of self, to kind of really check in, particularly for those who feel like they're experiencing trauma, they're being traumatized by what they're seeing constantly on social media, what they're hearing, or feeling frustrated because they knew the verdict was going to be a certain way and they're just getting tired of it. And so they're just feeling overwhelmed. And so just essentially just saying, you know what, self-care, checking yourself, checking in with yourself, having conversations, reflecting, taking care of your mental health is an act of resistance. And it also is in contribution to moving this movement forward. So if nothing else, I want to give whoever needs permission because they feel like I should be doing something, I should be protesting, I should post this on social media. That sometimes, just as Pam was saying, not saying anything, and sometimes just taking that moment and sitting still. My one social media post I put was "Peace be still." And that's all I need to say at that moment, because that's what I needed. And so just self-care and mental health is also an act to move this movement forward.
Lewis, I'll ask you 1 minute, and then John, will you come back on?
Sure.
Well, I think that this is an awesome panel. I really appreciate y'all. I think for me, one of the challenges that we face right now as a country is that for a lot of folks, this is the first time that they've really conceptualized systemic practices. And for people who have privilege, they have the privilege of ignorance, meaning if they don't know about a huge portion of the population's experience, it doesn't negatively affect their day-to-day life, right? And what that does essentially is it creates an expectation of being comfortable. And I think to move forward, we have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is, I have white friends and counterparts, who can remember, from 30 years ago, the one time they were the only white person in a space, right? And they could remember it with clarity. it was a cold, windy Sunday morning, right? And you're like, dude, that's Tuesday for professional people of color, right? So I think for start thinking about and encouraging people to do is A, be uncomfortable, and B, get outside of your experiences, learn about other people's experiences, learn about systemic, structural, policy-based issues and systems so that you can understand that some of your successes were a byproduct of choices and being on the right side of policies that you didn't create, right? No kid chooses their parents or their neighborhood, but too often your neighborhood is destiny.
So Louis, so here's my last statement. I really appreciate you guys. There was something that my mother used to say to me, and it's hitting me strong now. I used to say, Mom, why am I always the only? And she says, you're not the only, you're the first. And I said, why do I have to be the first? And she was like, well, look, Martin Luther Darnell, it's preparing you for something bigger. Today was the something bigger, right? And so I appreciate you guys. I really appreciate this conversation. John, I want to turn it to you. And then let me say this. Paylocity, we really appreciate you providing this platform. There are going to be other conversations. But thank you all, the panelists, you guys were fantastic. If there are any questions left, answer, you got 30 seconds. John, over to you.
Perfect. Appreciate it. Thanks, Darnell. Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody, the Burtin group, all the panelists, Christine and James in the back handling all the technology, which is not my forte by a long shot. This has been extremely enlightening and I think really a powerful conversation, right? And, you know, we really believe in the idea of let's continue to talk, let's continue to confront, let's continue to try to understand. So I'm just thankful to everybody, thankful for the time, thank you for all the people that attended. As Darnell had said, you know, this is the first of many conversations. We hope to continue. And thank you guys very much. Have a great rest of your day.